Good evening, dear Insomniac. Come in. You've timed it well. Something rather unusual happened just before you arrived. I was at the window, watching the last of the light go off the meadow, and there was a fox out at the tree line, sitting very neatly, the way foxes do when they want you to know they're in no hurry. It watched this whole place arrive, lamps, walls, roof, and all, and didn't so much as flinch. Most creatures startle at that. This one simply watched, as though it had seen the trick before and was checking we still did it properly. Then it looked at the window. At me, I'd almost say. And then it was gone. Not run off, you understand. Just gone. Between one blink and the next. Now, I mention it because of the story I've pulled down for tonight, and because of who gave it to me. She came through a long while back, a traveller in robes the colour of maple leaves, with long white hair and a hood. She never once lowered, though the fire was warm, and I offered twice. She took her tea in both hands, very properly. She ate a rice cake I set out with enormous dignity, and then a second one with none at all, and looked briefly embarrassed about it, and I pretended very hard not to have seen. And when I asked, as I ask everyone, whether she had a story, she smiled. I could see that much, under the hood, and said she had one she'd been carrying 400 years, and that it was about time somebody else looked after it for a while. She told it start to finish without stopping. Then she was gone before dawn. No farewell, no sound of the door. Just her line in the guest log, in handwriting like brushstrokes, and the faintest smell of rain before rain. I wrote the story down that same morning, and every so often since, not often, just now and then, on certain evenings, there's a fox at the tree line, sitting very neatly, checking in on the place. I've stopped thinking it's a coincidence. I think she likes to know her stories being told, which is why, on evenings when I take this one down off the shelf, I make sure there are rice cakes with the tea. She was fond of them, my hooded visitor. It seemed only right to keep the habit. You're welcome to one, by the way. I made plenty. So, settle in, wherever the fire reaches you best. Let's not keep her waiting. This is the fox who wished to be found. At the foot of a green mountain, where the rice fields ended and the great cedars began, there was a small village that had lived beside a very old forest for as long as anyone could remember, and a good deal longer than that. The forest rose up the mountainside in deep, soft layers, cedar and pine down low, maple and beech further up, and higher still, where the mist liked to sit of a morning, trees so old that nobody in the village had names for them anymore. The paths in were few, and the paths out were fewer, and at the mouth of the widest path stood two small stone foxes, sitting up straight on mossy pedestals, facing each other across the trail. No one living had carved them. No one living knew who had. They had simply always been there, keeping their patient watch, their stone faces gone gentle and round with centuries of rain. And the village had a custom, old as the statues themselves. On quiet evenings, somebody, it was never arranged, it simply always happened to be somebody, would walk up to the stone foxes and leave a small offering between them, a handful of rice, a ripe persimmon in autumn, a rice cake wrapped in a leaf. In winter, when there was less to spare, sometimes only a single dried plum, set down carefully, with a bough. Because the village knew, the way you know things that have been true longer than proof, that the forest had a keeper. They called her the guardian of the wood. The old people said she was a kitsune, a fox spirit, older than the village, older than the paths, perhaps as old as the mountain itself. They said she could wear whichever shape suited her. Sometimes a fox with fur the colour of autumn at its very best moment, and sometimes a lady, a young woman in robes like maple leaves, with long white hair and a fox's ears that never quite hid themselves, and a great soft tail tipped with white like the first snow, which she was said to be either too old or too honest to bother tucking away. They said she was the reason lost travellers always, somehow, found their way out of the trees before dark, following a flash of red fur, or a figure glimpsed between the trunks, or a path that hadn't seemed to be there a moment before. They said she was why the streams ran clear, and why the storms that battered the far side of the mountain always grew gentle before they reached the village. They said that no child had ever come to harm in that forest, not once, not ever. Nobody had seen her properly in 3 generations, which brings us to Hannah. Hannah was 6 years old, and then 7, and then 8 over the course of this story, so we'll let her be small to start with. She had round cheeks and quick dark eyes, and a way of going quiet that her grandmother said meant she was noticing something. And Hannah was nearly always noticing something. The pattern frost made on the well bucket. Which of the chickens was sad? The way the forest, at dusk, seemed to lean very slightly toward the village, like something listening at a door. She loved the forest edge more than any other place in the world. She was allowed as far as the stone foxes, and no farther, and so the stone foxes became her friends. She brushed the fallen leaves off their heads in autumn. She swept the snow from their pedestals in winter. And when it was her family's turn, or even when it wasn't, she liked to be the one who carried the offering up the path and set it down between them with the small bow her grandmother had taught her. "Why do we bow?" she asked once. "Because she's watching," her grandmother said, quite matter-of-factly, the way she might have said the kettle was on. "She's always watching. It's polite to let her know that you know." So Hannah bowed. And because she was Hannah, she also every single time took one long, careful look into the trees, just in case. For a whole year she saw nothing but forest. And then, one evening, at the very end of summer, when the light had gone amber and the cicadas were winding down like tired clockwork, Hannah set a rice cake between the stone foxes, bowed her bow, looked up, and saw someone standing among the trees. Not 10 steps up the path, half in the shade of a great cedar, stood a lady. She was tall and still, and dressed in robes the colours of a maple in October, deep red falling into gold. And her hair was long and white as winter, and on top of her head, quite plainly, where anyone could see them, were 2 soft foxes' ears turned toward Hannah with polite attention. Behind her, low to the ground, a great plumed tail swayed once, slowly, its white tip catching the last of the light. Now, a sensible child would have run home to tell everyone. Hannah was a sensible child mostly. But she was also a noticing child, and what she noticed was this. The lady was not standing the way a stranger stands. She was standing the way somebody stands when they have been waiting a very long time, for you in particular, and are trying not to look as though they have. There is a difference. Hannah couldn't have explained it. She was simply certain of it all the way through. So she stepped past the stone foxes, 1 step, 2, and said in her politest voice, "I can see you, you know." The fox ears went up. The whole forest seemed to hold still. Even the cicadas paused. "Well," said the lady, and her voice was warm and amused and soft as a paw on moss. "That makes you the first in quite some time." Hannah knew she ought to be frightened. She checked, carefully, the way you'd pat your pockets. There was no fright anywhere in her at all. There was only the lady stepping out of the cedar shade with a walk like autumn arriving, unhurried and certain and quietly grand. And her eyes were gold, old gold and kind, like lantern light through paper. And they were looking at Hannah with frank and equal curiosity, one noticer to another. Hannah bowed, the proper bow, the offering bow, and the lady, gravely and gracefully, bowed back, sweeping one wide sleeve out before her like a courtier. "You're her," Hannah said, "the guardian." "I keep the wood," the lady agreed, settling herself down on the flat mossy stone beside the path, as though it were a throne that had been carved for exactly this, arranging her tail neatly over her knees like a lap blanket. "The streams, the paths, the storms, the lost, it's steady work. I've been at it a long while." She tilted her head, and one white ear tilted with it. "You're the one who sweeps the snow off my statues." "They looked cold," said Hannah. "They're stone." They still looked cold. The guardian regarded her for a long moment, and something in the gold eyes went warmer still. "Yes," she said. "I thought you might be that sort. That's why I let you see me." And that, on that amber evening at the end of summer, was how it began. Hannah came back the next evening, and the one after. She always brought something, a rice cake, a plum, once a small dried fish, which the guardian accepted with enormous dignity in her long pale hands, and ate with none at all, in one bite, and then looked briefly embarrassed about, which Hannah pretended very hard not to have seen. They talked, the way a small girl and an ancient guardian spirit will, which is to say, Hannah asked questions, and the guardian answered perhaps 1 in 3, and the rest of the time they sat together on the mossy stone at the forest's edge and watched the light go down the valley, which suited them both completely. The guardian knew everything about the forest, everything. She knew where the Tanuki family denned, and how many kits they'd had. She knew which stream the herons favoured and why. She knew the whereabouts, at any given moment, of every deer, every squirrel, every beetle going about its slow, important business under every log on the whole mountain. "You can't know everything," Hannah protested once. "Ask me anything." "Where's the biggest mushroom in the forest?" "Under the fallen beech by the second stream, north side, grown up through a knothole, so it's come out shaped like a lantern," said the guardian, without a heartbeat's pause, smoothing her sleeve. "There's a slug on it presently. He's very pleased with himself." Hannah thought about this for a while. "Doesn't it get boring?" she asked. "Knowing where everything is?" And the guardian went quiet, a different quiet than usual, and looked out over the valley, and her tail went very still across her knees, and she didn't answer that one at all. It was a few evenings later that Hannah found the answer anyway, entirely by accident, in the way she found most things. She had arrived early, while the guardian was still finishing her rounds, and so Hannah waited by the stone foxes and watched the village children down in the lane below, playing the game they always played in the last hour of light. One child stood against the storehouse wall, hands over eyes, counting slow and loud, 8, 9, 10, while the rest scattered like sparrows, folding themselves behind rain barrels and under porches, giggling and shushing each other badly. And Hannah became aware, gradually, of the guardian standing beside her, watching the game, very intently. She was leaning forward the smallest amount, both fox ears pricked all the way toward the lane, the white tip of her tail perfectly, unnaturally still, the whole ancient length of her tilted toward the sound of the counting, the way a plant tilts toward the sun. "You know this game?" Hannah asked. "I have watched it," said the guardian, not taking her eyes off the lane. "For 400 years." Hannah looked up at her. "Watched it," she repeated, "from the tree line. The rules change a little, every generation or so. The counting used to go to 50. I preferred 50. 100 is more modern." She said modern the way you'd hold something at arm's length. "The best hiding spot in that lane is the gap behind the miso barrels, and no child has used it in 60 years. It troubles me more than I can say." "But you've never played." The fox ears flattened, just slightly. "Who?" she said, with great dignity, gathering her sleeves, "would I have played with?" And Hannah, who was 7 by then, and who had a heart that noticed things the way her eyes did, heard everything underneath that question. 400 years of keeping, 400 years of watching over the games from the tree line, of guiding the lost and gentling the storms, and knowing where every single thing in the whole forest was always, at every moment, forever. Nothing in that forest could ever be lost to her. Nothing could ever be hidden from her. And nobody in 400 years had ever once come looking for her. Hannah stood up. She brushed off her knees. She walked to the nearest stone fox, put her hands over her eyes, and leaned against its mossy pedestal. 1, she said loudly. 2, 3. Behind her, there was a silence so complete, so utterly astonished, that she peeked between her fingers. The guardian was staring at her, the keeper of the whole mountain, 4 centuries old, frozen with one sleeve half raised, her golden eyes wide as lanterns. "You have to hide," Hannah said. "That's the rule. I count to 100, and you hide, and then I come and find you. Everyone knows that." "You," said the guardian, and her voice had gone strange and soft, "will not find me, little one. I have 4 centuries of forest in me. I know every shadow on this mountain. I can be a fox, or a mist, or a patch of sunlight if it pleases me. It wouldn't be fair." "Then you'd better make it easy the first time," said Hannah, and put her hands back over her eyes. 4, 5, 6. And she heard it. She would remember the sound her whole life, a swirl of robes like leaves taking the wind, a single soft footfall, and a laugh like a bell heard across water. Gone. Hannah counted the whole 100, slow and honest, the way the game deserves. Then she turned around and walked into the forest to find a guardian spirit. She did not find her quickly. Let it be said plainly, the guardian had not made it easy, whatever she'd been told, because 400 years of dignity do not simply roll over. Hannah looked behind the great cedar. She looked under the fallen beech, disturbing the slug, who was still very pleased with himself. She looked up into branches and down into hollows, while the light turned gold, then rose, then grey-blue, and the forest filled up with evening around her. And never once, not for a moment, was she afraid, because a forest with a guardian in it, even a hiding one, is the safest place in all the world. And little by little, Hannah stopped looking with her eyes, because her eyes were getting her nowhere, and started looking the way she was best at. She noticed a patch of moss growing greener and thicker than any moss around it, in a spot with no more water and no more light than anywhere else. As though someone warm sat there, often, and the moss had grown grateful. She noticed a young tree, storm-snapped and half-fallen, that had been propped carefully, its broken trunk guided to lean on a stone so that it could go on growing sideways, which it was doing stubbornly, covered in new leaves. She noticed a bird's nest tucked in a bramble, with a single long white hair woven in among the twigs. Oh, thought Hannah, there you are. You're everywhere. And she understood all at once the way the game had to be played. You could not find the keeper of the forest by hunting for a lady-shaped shadow, or a fox-shaped one either. You found her the only way she could be found, by her care. Wherever the forest was most tended, most quietly, invisibly loved, that was where she'd be. Hannah stood very still in the blue evening. She thought about the whole mountain. She thought, if I had spent 400 years looking after all of this, and somebody was finally looking for me, where would I wait? Then she turned around and walked straight back down the path to the stone foxes, to the little worn place between them where the offerings went, the one spot in the whole forest where, for as long as anyone could remember, the village had left small kindnesses for a keeper they never saw. The guardian was sitting there, exactly there, kneeling in the offering place, with her robes pulled around her like fallen maple leaves, her hands folded in her lap, her tail curled close, waiting in the very spot where, for centuries, all the looking after had flowed the other way. "Found you," said Hannah. For a moment, the guardian said nothing at all. The gold eyes were very bright, brighter than lantern light, brighter than evening allowed for. And when she finally spoke, her voice was not quite steady, for the first time in 400 years. "Yes," she said, "you did." After that, they played every evening the weather allowed, and a good many it didn't. They took turns, because that also is the rule. When Hannah hid, the guardian counted, she counted beautifully, in a low sing-song, sleeves folded, eyes properly covered by both long pale hands. And Hannah never once worked out whether the keeper truly couldn't find her for half an hour at a stretch, or whether a spirit who knew the whereabouts of every beetle on the mountain was perhaps taking the scenic route on purpose, drifting between the trees with her chin lifted, announcing, "Not behind this one," in tones of theatrical bafflement, while Hannah stuffed her sleeve in her mouth in a hollow log 3 steps away. She suspected. She never asked. Some kindnesses are rude to unwrap. And when the guardian hid, she hid as only she could. Some evenings she hid as a fox, red gold and low in the ferns. Some evenings she hid as a lady standing so perfectly still among the slim white birches that she was simply one more of them, hair and all. She hid once as a patch of late sunlight on a stone, and once as the smell of rain before rain, and once. She was so pleased with this one that she confessed it herself when Hannah walked past for the 3rd time, as a ring of small gold mushrooms. But Hannah found her more often than not, and always the same way. By the tended things, the propped trees, and grateful moss and mended nests, the small warm signatures of care that the guardian could no more stop leaving behind her than she could stop being what she was. "You cheat," the guardian told her once admiringly. "You shine," said Hannah. "It's not my fault." The seasons went around the way they do. Persimmons between the stone foxes, then snow on their heads, then plum blossom, then cicadas again. Hannah turned 8 and grew and kept coming, and the village noticed, of course they noticed, villages notice everything, that their smallest noticer went up to the forest edge every evening and came back every nightfall calm and bright and full of a happiness she never fully explained. They noticed, too, that the streams ran clearer than ever that year, and the storms turned gentler than ever, and that on certain evenings, if you stood in the lane at dusk and listened, you might hear, far up the mountain, faint as anything, a low voice counting, and a child's laughter, and after it, a silence that was somehow the fullest, safest silence in the world. The grandmothers only smiled and left a little extra rice between the statues. On the last evening of this story, though not the last evening of the game, which as far as anyone knows is being played on that mountain still, the fireflies came up out of the ferns while Hannah was seeking, and the whole forest filled with small drifting lights, and she found the guardian, kneeling in the offering place, as she so often was, because it had become less a hiding spot than a home square, the place the game returned to, the way all good games have one. And Hannah, who had walked a long way that evening, and was 8 years old and very full of dinner, sat down against that warm autumn-coloured shoulder. "Just for a moment," she said. And the guardian drew her great soft tail around the girl, like a blanket that had been 400 years learning exactly how, and the fireflies drifted, and the streams said the quiet things streams say. "One," murmured the guardian, very slowly, very softly, somewhere above her head. 2, 3. "That's not how the game," said Hannah, mostly asleep. "It's how it goes tonight," said the keeper of the forest. "Hide in your dreams, little one. I'll count the whole 100. Take all the time you like." And she counted, slow as honey, soft as moss, while the child slept against her side, and the fireflies kept their small lights burning, and down in the valley the village lamps went out one by one, every house of it watched over, the way it had always been watched over, by a guardian who knew where everything on her mountain was, and who now, at last, after 400 years, knew what it was to be found. There, back onto the shelf it goes, safe and sound, exactly where its owner can find it, should she ever come to check. I rather think she does. And now you know why I waved at the window earlier. It seemed only polite. She's always watching, as the grandmother said. It's good manners to let her know that you know. In fact, before we settle for good, there's one rice cake I've been keeping back all evening, and I suspect you've already guessed who it's for. I'll just set it out on the front step, between the door and the dark, the way the village used to do. Nothing grand, just a little kindness, left where a keeper might pass. One keeper to another if you like. We ought to look out for each other, those of us who mind old places through the night. There, done. The step's a poor substitute for 2 stone foxes, but I think she'll forgive the arrangements. And you, Dear Insomniac, you've nothing left to hide and nothing left to seek. You've been found. The fire found you, the chair found you, and the quiet's just now finding you too. So close your eyes and hide away in your dreams, and I'll do what her guardian did. I'll count the whole 100. Take all the time you like.
1, 2, 3,